Hello. I see so many people here have joined us. This is wonderful. We'll get started in just a moment. I just wanted to welcome all of you and our panelists, and we'll get started momentarily. So thank you so much. Hello again, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to this afternoon's program. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums, the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and the Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity. Now, before I turn the program over to Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Libraries, I encourage you to ask questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A in the bottom of your screen. We'll have time to answer your questions. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, take it away.
Thank you, Jamie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our first talk in the Sheridan Library's Fall Speaker Series, Lunch with the Libraries. I hope you will find the next 30 minutes nourishing to both your body and mind. Our Friends group has been sponsoring programs like this for more than 85 years. Through these activities, we provide resources for Hopkins students and faculty and produce programs to engage the university and Baltimore communities. We are most grateful to our Friends Advisory Council, our support staff, and our co-sponsors, the Johns Hopkins Alumni Affinity Group, for their support in making these online talks possible. If you are not a friend of the libraries, I encourage you to consider becoming one by making a gift at library.jhu.edu. Our hope is that these programs will give you a behind-the-scenes look at some of the fascinating work that our libraries are accomplishing on a daily basis, and that you'll want to become a member. Today, you'll see how the Sheridan Libraries preserves history and historical scholarship by operating one of the oldest book and paper conservation labs in the country, where damaged but invaluable materials are regularly rescued and revised for students and researchers for generations to come. I have been lucky enough to tour our conservation lab in person and to see the incredible work by our conservationists to preserve historical materials as early as 2000 BC. Now I'm delighted to introduce Jennifer Jarvis, who will tell us about her work as part of this fantastic group. Jennifer has an MA in Conservation Studies from the University of Sussex in England, as well as a diploma in bookbinding from the North Bennett Street School in Boston. From 2008 to 2011, she was the chief conservator for the Derry and Raphoe Diocesan Library Project in Northern Ireland. She has also held positions at Columbia University and the Smithsonian. She has been a book and paper conservator at the Sheridan Libraries since 2015, and we are delighted to have Jennifer with us today. Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting us to the Conservation Lab to learn about your exciting and important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And thanks to everybody who is participating. I'm going to start sharing my screen in just a second here. Let's see. Jamie, my screen is saying that I have my screen sharing disabled.
Right, you are a co-host. You should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, let's try again. There we go. Thank you.
Of course.
All right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk for a little bit about, let me go back to the beginning here. Just an introduction to conservation at Hopkins. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what conservation is, what book and library conservation is in particular, and then how we, what that means in the context of Hopkins. So first of all, what is conservation exactly? Probably you've heard the term conservation, you may have heard the term restoration or preservation, and they're interchangeably in by different people, but I'm going to use our professional body's definition, which is kind of an umbrella use of the term conservation to mean encompassing actions taken toward the long-term preservation of cultural property. Conservation activities include examination, documentation, treatment, and preventive care supported by research and education. And so I just have a few images here of some of our activities. What we usually think of in terms of conservation is what Jim alluded to, the actual rescuing, the restoration of our materials. But we also play important roles in an advisory capacity and in outreach to both to students, graduates and undergraduate students, and people like yourselves. And one of my favorite things about this profession.
I'm hosting a program, bud.
One of my favorite things about this profession is sort of the combination of old and new, and how that's kind of brought together in what we do every day. So, and that I think most people can kind of understand that if you have a historic object, that a knowledge of how it would have originally been made and the ability to recreate those kinds of objects is really useful. So that kind of old world technological information is really important to have. And I have a few images here of an example of that, a course that I was able to take in the Cognac region of France a number of years ago at a paper mill. And I think lots of people have had experiences or seen people making handmade paper, but what makes this paper mill unique is that they're actually using equipment and reproductions of equipment that would have been used in the 15th century and the 16th century to really make paper that acts, looks, and feels like centuries old paper. So the piece of equipment that you see in the middle there is a stamper that just creates paper in a way that just is not done anymore, and it results in a really long fibered and strong paper. And a lot of conservators came together at this workshop to try to understand why are these books that have this kind of paper from the 15th and 16th centuries, do they last so long? How did they make this paper to make it so strong but supple? And we really didn't understand how to do that. And so this workshop was a chance for us to come together and try to recreate those papers and try to really figure out what was going on. So that was a fun opportunity. And then, so combining old technologies with then modern day new technologies and trying to keep on top of changes in the field, we're always trying to figure out the best way to preserve something, to clean something, to repair items in our collections. So this, for example, was another workshop that I attended where we were using chelating agents to try to remove metallic impurities in more modern paper to reduce foxing stains or other kinds of stains in mostly 19th and 20th century paper. So that kind of combination of old and new, I find really fascinating and keeps me really engaged in my profession. I want to talk a few minutes about how we kind of got to where we are in the conservation of books and library materials. And we can really date the birth of modern conservation as we see it now, such as in the lab at Hopkins, where an institution has its own lab of trained conservators. We can kind of trace that pretty directly back to the flood of the River Arno in Florence in 1966. And some of you may have read about this in other contexts, but this was a really devastating, massive flood in Florence, where the rivers rose to a height of about 15 feet and stayed that way for several days. And when the waters receded, one of the most affected places in Florence was the National Library. And so these tens of thousands of books, hundreds of thousands of books had been sitting in muddy water for several days. And when the waters receded, the mud caked on all of the books. And so this really caused a kind of worldwide reaction to and a drawing together of bookbinders from around Europe, and the United States to try to rescue these books. And it was really the first time that bookbinders came together and shared information and triaged collections. And as I said, a lot of the people that were involved in this process went on to become leaders in our field and still are. And so it just had a really big impact on our profession. Now, I'm gonna play a few minutes of a video from video was made in 1968 of the restoration project in Florence. It's not good quality video, so I apologize for that, but I do really like to show this to our classes because I think it really shows the vast scale of this effort. And I also just think it's always interesting to look at a kind of snapshot of a project like this. So I'm just gonna cue that up and hopefully that works.
"40 stainless steel sinks have been built in the washing section of the library, each thermostatically controlled. Strange as it may seem after a flood, nearly every book needs to be washed, leaf by leaf. The washing water contains a fungicide solution. Leaves are floated on ply boards, which are easily submerged. Gelatine and mud smears are brushed away. It takes about 4 hours to wash a book. Some books are resized after washing in a parchment size, or methyl cellulose, or polyvinyl alcohol. Where leaves are particularly fragile, they are soaked in an alcohol solution containing soluble nylon. Size binds the paper fibers together and gives support in handling, particularly to short-fibered and highly absorbent papers. The books are more alkaline after the flood. Random pH tests are taken with a flathead electrode, and a few books which suffer from too much acidity, particularly from ink stains, are deacidified. Bleaching is limited to print restoration and severe staining such as from the tannin in leather covers which make the pages illegible. It is then neutralized with an anti-chlor, washed for 6 hours, and then deacidified. each book doubles its weight with water absorbed during washing.
I've never done that to a book, just so you know, flapped a book around like that. Always makes me laugh.
Drying must be done carefully and at the right temperature and speed. Too violent a heat buckles the paper. Too low a heat is a waste of time, for it takes between half an hour and an hour, according to the thickness of paper, to dry a book. Olive netting is used for the racks on which the leaves are laid. Warm air at 30 degrees centigrade circulates through the specially constructed drying cabinets. The 4 of them, 20 feet long, take the whole length of the drying room. Trolleys full of racks can be wheeled into them. An aquabuoy is used to take random samples of water content. The leaves are taken up again from the nets and handed over to library staff for checking and putting in order. The reassembled book is wrapped in brown paper impregnated with fungicide to await mending and binding.
Okay, so that's just a few minutes to give you a kind of a glimpse of what the enormity of that project. And I was told a number of years ago, I assume that this is still true, that there are still lots and lots of books in that kind of wrapped up state in the National Library awaiting treatment, just because the amount of resources that it would take to fully rebind all of those books is just enormous, and it can't be sustained forever. So, so kind of looking at the factors that the book conservators in Florence had to face and had to deal with, and the factors that we today have to deal with when we think about conservation of libraries and books. There's kind of 3 main factors that set book conservation apart from other disciplines in conservation. If you think about paintings or objects, or works of art on paper, and that is the books are really composite objects to a greater degree than other kinds of objects. If you think about the paper, the inks, the pigments, the thread, the different textiles that could be present, the wooden boards, and particularly older books, animal skins, leather, parchment, metal features in the decoration. They really are composite objects, and kind of a basic understanding of all of those different materials and how they interact is necessary in order to conserve them properly. Another big factor, or another distinguishing characteristic, is the ubiquity of books. This is common sense, I'm sure, but if you just in your mind imagine the number, the millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of books that are existing in the world as compared to paintings or any other kind of cultural heritage object, you're really talking just about a different level, different scale altogether. And then functionality, and that's really, to me, one of the most interesting and really comes into play here at Hopkins. So if you think about a museum or other collecting institution that has paintings or sculptures or even clocks, you don't think about those as having to work when they're on display or when they're even being used. They're looked at. You're not interacting with them necessarily. Whereas with a book, in order to get the most out of it, you are using it, you're opening it, you're turning the pages, the book is moving, and that brings a whole added complexity to the notion of how do you restore it, how do you treat it so that it can be used. And at a place like Hopkins, we are a university research library, and we take pride in the fact that our collections are available to use by our students and by our greater Hopkins community. And I just have a slide here of the 3 main collections that I work on at the Peabody Library, which most of you are probably familiar with, and the Eisenhower Library here where I am now, and the Garrett Library at the Evergreen Museum and Library in Baltimore. So at Hopkins, we have many books in our collections are used really heavily by our curators, by professors. Students are welcomed into the reading room, and that means that some collections get heavily used. And so the idea of preserving them and conserving them means that we have to be a little bit more aggressive in our approach so that we really maintain kind of a rigorous functionality in the books. So one aspect of our treatment approach at Hopkins is restoration. In the slide here that you see, we have a small medieval manuscript. And this is how it came to us in the conservation lab. You can see it had been repaired in the past. And the main problem, as you see in the image on the right, is that the book did not open. The pages did not flex. You can see there it's standing upright. And so obviously you can bend and flex those pages and make the book open, but it doesn't want to lie open. And so that can cause strain on the pages, on the parchment, on the pigments used in the manuscript. And so our approach to something like this really is pretty interventive in the sense that we're going to take it apart and put it back together essentially in a better way. And so here's some images of that treatment in progress where the book was taken completely apart and the old covers were removed and discarded. And actually, I should say usually not discarded, because often they contain historic information and we don't want to lose that. So oftentimes the original binding materials are kept, but they're not reused in the new binding. And then, so the book was sewn on all new materials, and you can see that it has new cover board laced on. This is how it would appear right before covering. And then afterwards, you can see here in the image on the right, just in comparison with the before treatment image, that it opens beautifully and in a very relaxed way. So this could be handed to a reader or a student, a professor using it in a class, and it could be used without much concern for its ability to survive. So that is an approach that we take here to kind of enable our curators to use the collections. But oftentimes, just as many times, we don't have to take such an aggressive approach. So this is an example of a book that was in the lab recently, and you can see that it is in its original kind of tattered parchment. The term is called a limp vellum binding. It's not particularly attractive, but it is its original covering. And this particular book was not especially rare. The reason the curator was so excited to purchase it was actually for the censorship that was inside the book. This edition of the Works of Saint Cyprian has a preface written by Erasmus, and it was totally expurgated by the church to cover up. They obviously didn't remove the preface, but they just wanted to cover it up and show that they did cover it up. And so in this case, the problem with this book was mainly some loose pages, and I was able to sew those loose pages back into the book without kind of interfering with the cover of the book and with the overall appearance of the book. And in that way, preserve a little bit more of its historic character while still making it available for researchers. And then I'll just show a few slides of kind of our preventive approach to the care of our materials. This is an example of another little manuscript that you can see here on exhibition a few years ago at the Peabody Library. And you can probably tell that you can see that it has its original silk ties, and you could probably see that those ties are a little bit battered and worn. Ties such as these are a common feature of books of this period, but usually they will have fallen off or broken off over the centuries. And so it's not common that you find them all intact and in such good condition. And of course, we want to keep them attached and keep them in good condition. So you can see here in exhibition, we were careful to ensure that the ties were supported. You can kind of see in the image here on the left-hand side, tiny little magnets which were placed on either side of the tie just to hold it in place so that it was completely supported in that exhibition cradle. So and in exhibition it was supported, and then also in storage we created this little slip cover where you can still see all of the elements of the binding. You can see that it has the ties, you can see the decoration on the cover, but it is protected in handling and in storage. Those ties are not going to get damaged by anyone who's using the book in the future. And if it comes up for exhibition in the future, it's simple enough to remove that slip cover and put a new one on. And then I have one more to show, and then we'll go into questions. This is a book that was used by a graduate student a few years ago, and she was really studying. This is a book of emblems, and she was really spending a lot of time, many hours with this book. And she wanted to study the text itself, but also the paper. She was examining and looking for watermarks in the paper. So she was just spending a lot of time really examining it. And the risk was that the sewing, or in this case, the stitching would pop off. And you can see in the bottom right here that it was kind of hard to see in the margins, in the gutter, excuse me, of the text. And so the tendency would kind of be to pull it open even farther, and that would risk popping the stitching. And so what we did is just created a cradle specific for this book that supported the book in its weakest areas so that she could turn the pages, hold them down in place with these kind of mylar straps, and that it would stay open for her, but that it was still protecting the book and not risking any damage to it while she used it. So I think my time is up for talking, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and very interesting and informative. So I do have some questions that I'd love to ask you, starting with this one. Are there things they are doing or did in that 1968 film that today you would never do because of potential harm to the books? I know you mentioned shaking the book, but anything else?
Yeah, so we do have the capability to wash books, and I won't say that we never do it, but we're much more conservative about what we would choose to wash nowadays, because it is so invasive. And it honestly, for us in a library, it's not necessary. If a book is dirty or a book has some staining, if you can still read it, if you can still get the information out of it that you need, there's not really a need, and washing can remove, if any of you have handled lots of old books, you might have come across books that have been washed and then really pressed flat, and it removes kind of the life of the paper. It removes the plate marks from any plates. It can remove the impression that the type makes on the paper. And it just, to me, it's unnecessary, and it's unfortunate. So we try not to wash things as often. Now, in that case, those books were covered in mud, and there might be reasons for it. But that's one example of something we might be a little more conservative about nowadays.
Thank you. So I have another question. What is the most challenging book you've worked on from the collections?
Well, I'm working now on a book that is a 13th century gospel, and it has a lot of damage to some of the first leaves, and I guess it's very challenging because it's a very important book. It's very old and very important, and so everyone will expect that it receives the very best treatment, which of course it will, but that doesn't always necessarily translate into having a fancy looking treatment or a fancy looking binding. So where it's missing pages or missing portions of leaves, I have to kind of decide, what's the line between conserving it and restoring it, if that makes sense. So those are really tricky decisions where I have to figure out where am I crossing the line into restoration that is not necessary, and how do I kind of make those decisions? So I don't know if those are the most challenging decisions that I make. Not necessarily one book, that's just an example from one book, but I think those questions of where to draw that line are what are most challenging for me.
Thank you. What is the current professional opinion about the best ways to de-acidify paper?
Yeah, so we stopped mass deacidification of our collections a number of years ago. There are still institutions that do it, but we felt like the science was not showing that the deacidification was really going deep within the paper, that you're deacidifying on the surface of the paper, but it's not really penetrating. And so I think the decision was made that it wasn't worth the money. And I think that when you deacidify something that is already really brittle, you can deacidify it, but you still are not restoring flexibility and strength to the paper. That's a whole different question. And so what we were finding is that we were sending things off for mass deacidification. They were coming back and still brittle, still unusable. So you haven't really changed the handleability of the items. So we've kind of steered away from that, especially in a mass deacidification way. We don't do that anymore.
Well, thank you. So we're coming up on the end of our time. We're actually, actually we're not, sorry. What are your, so this is actually a good question. I'm curious. What are best practices and the most protective ways to conserve books in our homes?
Yeah, it's fairly straightforward. I try not to get too in the weeds when I talk to people about this. It can be hard for people. The best advice I can give you is stay away from extremes of heat and cold and moisture. So basically, don't store them in your attic, don't store them in your basement, which I know is where most people have the space to store things. But those are the areas obviously that are least climate controlled, and in the basement, especially most prone to moisture. And that's just where you're going to get the most problems. If you can if you have the luxury and you can afford to do this, I would also think about keeping bookshelves away from external walls, because that's where you can get that kind of condensation or moisture buildup where you have, especially an uninsulated wall, a bookshelf right against a cold exterior wall. I've seen a lot of libraries in historic houses, especially where everything looks fine, and then you go to take the books off the shelf and there's just mold all in the back of the shelf because they're against that external cold wall. So that's it. And then if you have space to lie things flat where it looks like they need to be laid flat because they're big or oversized, heavy, laying those items flat is always going to be safer than storing them upright if possible.
I have one more question for you, and then we're going to wrap it up. Do you collaborate with other conservation programs in the Baltimore area, such as the BMA and the Walters?
Yes, we do. Actually, we have a good relationship with the BMA and the Walters. We have trained actually the Walters technicians, a few of them, on how we make book cradles. They've come here and they've reciprocated and allowed us to sit in on trainings that they've had. The BMA doesn't employ any book conservators, but they've been so helpful to us in the past. We've had questions about photographs or different prints, which isn't our specialty. And so they've actually been able to come over and advise us, and we've been really grateful for that help.
Well, that's so wonderful. So I see we've had many, many questions, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take your questions, the ones that are in the Q&A, and I'm going to share them with Jennifer after the program. And if she is so inclined and has time, she'll respond to you. And so for now, yeah, thank you so much. So we'd like to thank you for your time and your talent. And we'd also like to thank all of you for joining us for today's webinar. A follow-up email will be shared with you following the webinar that will not only include a recording of this program and our resources and our event schedule, but we will also encourage you to become a friend of the libraries and support our libraries. We have many more of these up to in the pipeline, so we encourage you to register for our series of Lunch with the Libraries. We have a lot of great ones. As I'm sure you know from this one, it was amazing, and our others will be amazing as well. So we hope you'll join us. Thanks again, and I want you all to be safe and happy and have a wonderful weekend. So thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.